und hat mir das Auge mit Tränen gefüllt. Okay, let's talk about this. Hey there. My friend Jordan asked me, pretty sure it was Jordan, but it's a long time ago, so everything blurs. The dark side is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural. You can't see what I'm doing with my hands. Stop thinking! Moving on. John asked me, can you talk about music nibs? And the answer is probably, but I'm not sure I'm the best person to do it. And I'm going to dash all your hopes and dreams straight away. I'm not going to do any writing samples. And the simple reason for that is not that I'm unwilling, but I simply do not own any more music nibs. I don't have any. So I can't. But I promise I'm going to leave some links below to reviews I did of pens, or at least that have writing sample videos of mine that have writing samples of music nib pens. Okay, what can I say? Well, first of all, if you want to have a good reference to anything related to fountain pens, I cannot recommend Richard Binder's website enough, richardspens.com. He also has a clear description on what music nibs are. So if you want to just read it, you don't care, you know I'm not going to do writing sample anyway, bugger off to that website, have a look. I'm not offended. Okay, so credit where credit is due, obviously. I did read his website, and some of the information here, I didn't write anything down, so whatever I have is going to be paraphrased. But bear in mind, it's a very informative website. So source credited here. What is a music nib? Well, it's a nib traditionally made to write music with. So music, notes that I can't write. That's why I'm doing this, because I can't read notes. You have to draw a line somewhere. Greek, Cyrillic, Church Slavonic. I drew the line there. Hot chocolate. That was the marshmallow. Okay, so a music nib. Sorry, I didn't expect that. So, a music nib, typically a smooth stub. Now, here we already enter murky waters. What's a stub? A traditional nib. And now I'm really assuming you don't know anything about nibs, because I always assume that you may not know all this terminology, right? So if you do, then you just have to suffer through it. But if you're completely new to fountain pens, I don't want to throw around jargon and then assume everybody knows, because that's very elitist, and that makes a hobby like this less accessible to people. So a typical fountain pen nib is round. That means you have the nib. You may or may not have a breather hole. Often you do. There is a slit, and then there are two tines. This is particularly important because I'll come back to tines. At the end of those two tines is welded a ball of very hard metal, because if you have say a gold nib, gold is way too soft. If the tip of that nib would be soft, like gold, it would wear out very quickly as you write with it, right? So traditionally, that used to be iridium. These days, it's typically another very hard metal. Doesn't really matter. At the end of your nib is very hard metal. Now, that metal, that tipping, as we call it, is typically polished and ground in a specific fashion so that it's kind of round. Look at your fountain pen. Look whatever you have lying at hand, and pretty good chance it's going to have round tipping. And that means that if you draw a line downwards and sideways, it's approximately the same width. Now, if it's a very broad nib, or a double broad nib, that may already not be the case, but in principle with a round nib, that's the idea. Same line width in every direction that you're writing in. An italic nib is flatter, so there the tipping is actually ground more in something like a square shape, and as a result, you get a broad downstroke and a narrow side stroke. A stub nib we're almost there. A stub nib is kind of like an italic nib, except the corners of that tipping are rounded off a bit. And as a result, you get a little bit less line variation, so less of a difference between broad downstroke and narrow side stroke, but it is smoother to write with, because the very sharp corners, if you don't align them properly to the paper, they can kind of cut into the paper. That may not be pleasant, but you get more line variation. Now, most music nibs, traditionally speaking, are stub nibs. So they will offer some line variation where you get a fairly broad downstroke and a narrower side stroke, but it's not ultra crisp. For that super crispness, you would need an actual italic nib, and this is not that. So that's the first thing. It also has to be smooth. And I'm pretty sure this information, again, came from Richard Binder's website. And that smoothness makes sense too, because if you're composing, you don't want to have something that skips, so that like it has to be a smooth writing performance, right? So you can write your brilliant symphony, which I cannot do, but you know, there we are. So far, so good. So we have something stubby. Now, if you think of musical notes, that stubbiness kind of makes sense. You may want to get a narrow downstroke and a broader side stroke, or fill in the little bulb at the end. These things probably have a term attached to them, but again, I can't read and write music, so I really don't know what I'm talking about in that regard. I'm talking about the nib, not the music. So, there is that. Smooth performance, stub nib. Now, what's very interesting is that, first of all, it's not first of all, but it's like almost 7 minutes in. Anyway, what's interesting is that those nibs are also designed to be written with at a very high angle. And what's interesting is that with a stub nib, often, if this is the correct alignment to the paper, so think about what that means, right? Breather hole is on top, right? Breather hole is right there. You align it to the paper, right? You write with it this way. That's how you would write hello. Hello, right? These nibs, typically you can take sideways, put straight to the paper, so at a complete perpendicular angle to the paper, and write straight down. Now think about what that means. Broad downstroke, narrow side stroke, but if you rotate that pen, you get a very narrow, nice downstroke and a wider side stroke, which when you are writing musical notes, as I understand the concept, can be very helpful, right? Because you get those thin little stalks. So a music nib is kind of designed to do that. If you have a music nib, try it out and see if that's really the case, because a lot of them actually, I do remember actually testing that out. A lot of them are able to do that. I know that Platinum's music nib can, for example. I'll talk more about Platinum in just a second. The final thing I would say about music nibs, and then we can talk a little bit about my experience with music nibs. The final thing is a lot of people think music nibs have 3 tines. Normal nib, 2 tines and 1 slit in between them. Music nib, 3 tines and 2 slits, but that is not necessarily true. It is indeed the case that a lot of music nibs have 3 tines, 2 slits. I'm assuming this has something to do with a very even ink flow, right? 2 channels in the feed, consistent ink flow, no skipping, because you have to be able to continuously write. Now, if you've ever had an over-polished nib with baby's bottoms, as we call it, and you know that that's skipping, every time you lift the pen or the paper, you start to write again, it skips. You don't want that, because musical notes are not like cursive. You don't connect all of them, right? So it has to have a very consistent, even ink flow, and it should start up at the right time every time. Otherwise, it'd be very frustrating. I'm assuming that's why a lot of them had 3 tines, and you do see that in a lot of vintage nibs. Waterman had a vintage music nib, for example. It was quite flexy, and which did have 3 tines. The Platinum music nib, which you can get on the 3776 model, for example, also has 3 tines. Montblanc makes a music nib that has 3 tines. It's very expensive because it's one of their custom nibs, but you can get it. At pen shows you will find one if you're lucky. But there are other manufacturers, for example, Sailor comes to mind. Sailor has a music nib which has just 2 tines. It is, however, a stub. Now, as I said, I will link below review of the 3776 with a music nib, which is an ancient video, so the video quality is probably abhorrent, but it does have a writing sample. And I have a writing sample with a Sailor music nib, also a very pleasant nib. Both of them 100% are stubs. They are indeed very comfortable. And they do have that broad downstroke, narrow side stroke, whether you have 2 or 3 tines, same idea. There is a stubbiness to those nibs. Now the final thing I wanted to address, I hope this was helpful. I hope this was a clear explanation. I did my best. What about my experience with music nibs? I have tried a bunch. Platinum, Sailor, the Mont Blanc nib. I did try a Franklin Christoph music nib, which is also quite nice. I may have tried others, but then I forgot, and I just forgot. Mont Blanc's music nib is incredibly wide. It's a very, very broad nib. That's not just a double broad, it's not even a triple broad. It's very wide. It's really almost calligraphic, like a pilot parallel or something. I found that one it could run dry because it had such a huge ink demand. It was a little hard. The 3776, so the Platinum music nib, the Sailor music nib, both are very nice. They're very nice, pleasant nibs to use. My first music nib was that Platinum 3776. I don't have it anymore. It was a very pleasant pen. What I found interesting about it was that when I bought it, I thought it was going to have more flexibility to it because of the 3 tines. That nib, though, is a nail. You can press down on it as hard as you like. Those tines are not opening up anytime soon. So maybe don't actually try that, but very rigid nib. The Sailor nib had a little bit more springiness to it, but still not an enormous amount. So it's very interesting to me is that expectation that some people have that music nibs are flexible. Oh, and there was the Neponset nib from Noodlers. There was another 3-tine nib. That one was actually designed to be flexible. So don't go into it with the expectation that because something has 3 tines, they're more flexible than 2 tines. Do go into it with the expectation that ink flow should be pretty consistent, which frankly for the Noodlers pen, I've had a very good one and a not so good one, so there was more variation in that. The Sailor, very consistent. The 3776, I've tried other people's as well, very consistent. But just don't expect that flexibility. Do expect stubbiness. Invariably, everything I've mentioned has been stubby. Oh, the Franklin Christoph, by the way, was also very nice, very pleasant, also very broad. So ask yourself, I would say, why do I want a music nib? Are you going to actually use it to compose music? Then by all means. Do you just want a stub? Then get a stub. I know if you need the music nib, unless you want something special that looks more special. Ask yourself, do I need line variation? It will give you that natural line variation of broad downstroke, narrow side stroke, but it doesn't necessarily flex. So don't think you're going to get that. If you're good with all that, then by all means explore music nibs, because they can be a lot of fun. And they are certainly different, especially if you get one with 3 tines. It just looks cool. The Platinum 3776 nib is not the biggest nib in the world, but it looks cool. 2 breather holes, 2 slits. It looks really neat. And I think that is that's worth something in its own regard. Because then you do get that sort of wow factor. Oh, this is very different from all my other nibs. And that's pretty much it. Let me know. I really hope this was clear, and I hope this was somewhat useful. Let me know if you have any questions about music nibs that I probably can't answer. And let me know if you have any experience with music nibs in the comments below. I always appreciate that. It might be useful for other people to read if they are deciding whether or not to get a music nib. And that's it. I hope this was useful. I hope this answered Jordan's questions. And I'm glad to see you later. Bye.